Tansei, Kawa Pamitin Asamina, Kitsian Awa, Nims Nitsims. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Barb Clark, co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples Standing Committee of the Hospital Employees Union. I want to acknowledge with gratitude that I'm participating on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Swapnik people. I'm honored to be here as a guest on this land that our Indigenous people cared for well before our time. The Hospital Employees Union represents more than 50,000 workers in all areas of healthcare, and it's great to see so many fellow HEU members on the call with us today.
Tansei, good evening. Thank you all very much for joining us here tonight. I'd like to offer greetings to everyone here in the Facebook webinar and to all of you watching on YouTube now and in the future. In addition to thanking all of you tonight, I'd like to give thanks to the Hospital Employees Union for organizing the Equity and Pandemic Justice webinar series. Special thank you to President Barb Netterpel, the Communications Department, our equity officers, and our guest speaker, Shelley Saje Ricci. My name is Heather Manzik. I'm a co-chair of HEU's Indigenous Peoples Standing Committee. We begin by honoring the existence of the First Peoples of Turtle Island by acknowledging the territories that we are all joining from. I am joining you tonight from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coquitlam First Nation. I give thanks to the Coquitlam First Nation, who continue to live on these lands and care for them, along with the waters and all that is above and below. Much like many of you, I'm a guest to this land. My ancestors come from Treaty 1, St. Peter's Peguis First Nation in Manitoba. I give thanks to Mother Earth, our ancestors, hereditary leaders and matriarchs, creatures big and small, and future stewards for looking after these beautiful lands and waters. Indigenous peoples have a sacred relationship with nature that is at the heart of traditional teachings and practices. From the understanding of the interconnectedness of all things comes the understanding that the well-being of the earth is essential for survival. For hundreds of years, Indigenous peoples have demonstrated strength, resilience, and resistance in the face of violent efforts to separate them from their land, culture, and each other. In the month of September, we honor and remember the residential school survivors, the intergenerational survivors, and the children that never made it home. Territorial acknowledgement is a traditional custom and practice of Indigenous peoples in welcoming onto their land. It is also a step toward correcting the stories and practices that erase Indigenous peoples' history and culture toward inviting and honoring the truth. In the spirit of kindness, respectful relationship, and truth and reconciliation, we acknowledge the authentic history of Turtle Island. And as a form of respect wherever you live or work, take the time to learn and educate yourself of the Indigenous traditional territory that you are on. This can be a first step in your reconciliation journey. To learn about the traditional territories you are on, you may visit native-land.ca. Please feel free to share in the chat the territories you come from. I hope you will find tonight's discussion on the Red Dress campaign insightful and gain understanding and knowledge. Hi, miigwech.
I'm honored to be introducing our workshop today, the Red Dress Campaign. The Red Dress Campaign is a symbol of our missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited men and boys. Violence against Indigenous people is an ongoing national tragedy and continued genocide. The HEU Indigenous Standing Committee introduced in 2019 the Red Dress Pin, along with the 2021 No More Stolen Sisters Red Dress t-shirt, available at the HEU boutique. Mystic, Kapanyon, Ishuk, Kaikakio.
And I'd like to introduce our president, Barb Netterpel.
Welcome, everyone. Good evening. I am joining you tonight from the unceded and stolen lands of the Secwepemc people. I want to thank you, Barb and Heather, so much for your ongoing work and your commitment, and all of the members of the Indigenous Peoples Committee. Please, if the Indigenous Peoples Committee members are here tonight, introduce yourselves in the chat so that we can celebrate all of your efforts, because you have done really tremendous work. And the red dress pin is is one of the most beautiful, pieces of art that has come from the Indigenous Peoples Committee, and I thank you for that. We're very proud of this pin. So with the ongoing unveiling of the horrors in residential schools this year, I know that reconciliation is on top of so many of us, our minds, and more than ever, people are learning about these atrocities, many even for the very first time, and they're shocked and appalled by a colonial history. So tonight, as Barb Clark said, we will be focusing on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the Red Dress campaign that raises awareness and calls for action and justice. The fact remains, anti-Indigenous racism is a serious problem in our society, and it disproportionately affects women and girls. So in addition to Barb and Heather, here on our panel today, we have a special guest, and that's our friend Shelley Saje Ricci. Now, Shelley carries the name Paw Woman, belongs to the Eagle clan, and is of mixed Indigenous and European heritage with paternal ties to the Michelle Band in Treaty 6 territory. Now, she lives on the unceded Coquitlam Court territory, and she works on the Katzie or the Surrey territory. And now Shelley has worked in the K-12 sector for 14 years as an Aboriginal cultural educator and youth worker. She has also served as the executive at large with QP 728 for 3 terms and volunteers on QPBC's Indigenous and Women's committees. She's an activist, educator, a change maker, national QP facilitator, QPBC Diversity Vice President representing Indigenous people, and was one of 2 Indigenous worker representatives for the BC Federation of Labour, a position now that our sister Heather Banziak now, sits in, and we thank her so much for that. And of course, thank you so much to you, Shelley, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so over the next 45 minutes or so, the 4 of us are going to have a conversation. I'll be asking a few questions, but for those of you watching as participants, if you have any questions as we go through this conversation, please feel free to put them in the chat. We may not be able to answer every question, but we'll aim to have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to address some questions from members and viewers. And if we're feeling really spry, we might even be able to do them on the fly. We'll see what happens. So definitely put your questions in the chat for us. So let's get started. Shelley, tell us more about the Red Dress campaign and tell us a little bit about why it's relevant, particularly at this time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me, first of all. And I just want to introduce myself in the Anishinaabe language, which is not my language because I'm Cree, Mohawk, and Métis, but I received my spirit name in the territory of the Anishinaabe Ojibwe people when I was living and working in Toronto. So I just want to say Bojo, if you could try saying it back, Bojo.
Bojo.
Thank you. It's funny, I work in schools and kids always go bonjour, and I was like, no. But Bojo, Makwawanazid Koyajishnakas Megaze Dodum. That means greetings. My spirit name is Paw Woman, and my clan is Eagle. And I'm really happy to be here tonight, coming from the Coquitlam Core Territory, which is Port Coquitlam area. So the Red Dress Project, I know we're calling it a campaign, and I think as union activists, we're used to campaigns and we need campaigns, and I think we're moving it in the campaign mode. And it was originally called a project, so we'll watch a little video in a few minutes to hear from the artist who created it. But so it's a project that's been around since 2010 by Métis artist Jamie Black, who was in the Winnipeg region, and she created it to use her gift of being a visual artist to bring attention and use it as a platform to bring attention to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people. So I'm going to tell you what two-spirited mean, because that's often a question right off the hop. So two-spirited, as I've understood it and been taught it by a two-spirited elder during the national inquiries Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry. She said to think about, we believe in the spirit world, or people talk about heaven, and your spirits come down and they occupy your body for your earth walk. So at the time that she received her spirit, two spirits came down and twisted in and intertwined and came to inhabit her body. So she has the two spirits. And before colonial Canada existed, a lot of Indigenous people had there was five genders. So there was male and female, and then male female, so more masculine tendencies, and female male, and then there was trans. So there was five genders, but then when colonial explorers and government officials came, that was not acceptable. So they went kind of underground and into hiding and into the back tents, and still did their work. And they were people that were like honored and sought out because they could see things from the different perspectives. So that's what two-spirited means. I think the reason this is relevant now is because we are approaching a time in October, I think it's October 4th. Around that Sunday, we often do red dress projects and hang dresses out. I hang it right on my door outside of my condo. I live like a V of two long hallways, and then I put a note on there explaining what it means. But we hang it in the trees and in buildings and in schools, parks. So that's coming up October 4th, and we'll probably talk a bit more about that towards the end. And then May 5th is also another day. And as we come onto the very first September 30th, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation statutory holiday, which is similar to, in my opinion, November 11th, Remembrance Day, to honor the children that are being uncovered in the graveyards of the residential schools around Turtle Island. Turtle Island being Canada, United States, and Mexico's not there yet, but there's atrocities there as well. That day is kind of right next door to the day to honor the women and acknowledge these things. So these are kind of two simultaneous awareness, not really campaigns, but truths that regular Canadians need to know. Kids are learning it in school. They really are. They're learning it in school, right from like elementary school and right from kindergarten with the Orange Shirt story. So it's time for adults to get on board with the truth and learn as well, all Canadians. So I think if we watch the video about Jamie Black, it's about 3 minutes, and then we can continue after that. Sorry, it's the other video. Thank you. I think we're having trouble with sound. It always works in the test session beforehand, so we'll try a couple more times, and we can put the link in the chat too, and it could be watched later if you like, but you kind of get the idea of the dresses hanging in the background. So I think that's how we'll do it, because she talks about how she was inspired she went to Colombia actually, and she's seen a whole bunch of Colombian Indigenous women doing a ceremony, wearing red dresses for their lost people, maybe not just women, but their lost people. And she was inspired to create this as part of her art. So let's see if it works again. I hope so.
Just not having any luck.
Okay, we can continue on. We can put the link to that video in the chat, and then you can watch it if you're still curious about her and how she came about this idea of the red dress project. So some of the things she said in the video I kind of wrote down because I wasn't sure if we could do the video, so luckily. So it started around in 2010 around Winnipeg. The project highlights the epidemic of violence against Indigenous women. Each dress symbolizes an Indigenous woman, girl, or young child who has been murdered or is missing, representing just a portion of the thousands who have never returned home. The dresses hang empty, often blowing in the wind, in public spaces, so people are confronted with the truth of violence against Indigenous women. The art installation encourages people to be curious and hear the stories, and provides a space for the families to have discussions and share the truth about what's happened to their lost loved ones. The red dresses symbolize those who have passed on to the spirit world or are still missing and haven't returned home. Red is often said to be the only color that the spirits can see. So when she's doing this work, hanging the red dresses, I call it kind of honor work. Her purpose is to bring a platform to the voices that have been silenced by these women not having a chance to tell their stories because they're either still missing, not found, or they've come into harm's way. The relevance at this time is, I personally think it's relevant all the time. The fact that the National Inquiry on the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls found that Indigenous women and girls are 12 times more likely to come into harm's way, to go missing or get murdered than any other group of women. And you'll see all different statistics, but the fact is it's a high number of greater incidents, as well as 7 times more likely to be stalked by serial killers than any other ethnic group on Turtle Island. So if you think about that, it's not just stalked, they're hunted, they're tortured, they're murdered. Like, why do you think that is? Like, why is that? You know, so you're hearing these horrendous statistics, but why is it? So I, of course, have an answer for that. It is the continued genocide that's framed in systemic racism. So all of the systems that we live under, like if you think of it like a blanket in Canada and Turtle Island, have been created by colonial laws, and wiping out Indigenous laws, wiping out Indigenous ceremonies, Indigenous ways of being and doing things. That's what the residential schools were all about. So that lingers on. And so I believe in my teachings, in Ojibwe teachings, we are the 7th generation. So I talk about the children that I teach in the schools are the 7th generation, but we're also living in this time of a 7th generation as adults. And so we are coming to this truth time of rising. And so we can make actions so that things are going to be better for future generations as much as we can while we're still walking on earth at this time. So that's my answer to question 1.
That was even better than a video, Shelley. Thank you for that. So Barbara, Heather, is there anything you want to add to that? That was a very thorough answer, but is there anything you want to add? I'm also willing to go on to the next question, which, this is open to anyone. How do you think the pandemic has impacted this issue? And have you actually seen a change from before the pandemic to where we're at now? That's open to anybody.
I thoroughly researched this, but I'm going to give other voices a chance.
Heather has her hand up.
Oh, you're muted, Heather.
Sorry about that. The pandemic obviously has made it difficult for people to gather in the same way that we're more accustomed to. However, one of the things that's been good is that we are now learning about these different platforms, webinars, Facebook, Zoom. So maybe there's an advantage to that because there's more reach and more availability to get awareness out. So yeah, I think that's unfortunately, just not being able to kind of gather in the same way that we would like to, but having these different platforms has been a bonus.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's we have people viewing from all over the province and possibly even the country. So, this is something new, and it's certainly something we should be continuing. That's a great point, Heather. Shelley, what was your thoughts?
Okay, so I was researching this quite thoroughly, and so something to consider is I read an article around women's shelters in the Yukon. So this is a quote that I took from that. With the social distancing and self-isolation, women have had to stay in a home in a confined area with their abuser or perpetrator, and they cannot escape. There's nowhere they can go. So the women's shelters were sitting empty in the early parts of the pandemic. And so the women were trapped. The women and children are trapped inside the homes with the abusers. So that's an increase of violence against women. And then the ones that maybe escape in the northern area, if you think about Highway 16 and the downtown east side are two very famous areas for Indigenous women to go missing. Not just Indigenous women, but primarily Indigenous women going missing from those two areas. The reason it's called the Highway of Tears is because there's been so many tears cried for that reason. There's very limited cell service up there. So it's not like the women can use their telephones and their cell phones to call for help, if they even have cell phones, because there's also, poverty issues on reserve. And then if they're along the highway, there's so many of those crosses and grave sort of markers along that highway. The other thing is gender-based violence is predictable and a consistent side effect of economic and environmental crises, such as COVID-19. The stress of social and physical isolation measures, employment interruptions, financial pressures may lead to increased conflict in the household, which also may lead to factors that are associated with higher rates of intimate partner and sexual violence, such as including alcohol use, which contributes to that. And then you have authority figures like our beautiful Dr. Bonnie and political leadership giving consistent messages to stay home, right, in the early days. So women may be unaware that emergency rooms, shelters, transition houses remain open during COVID-19. And they also may face barriers to accessing these services. Medical staff have expressed concern that some women may be discouraged from reaching out so as not to burden or overwhelm the medical system, because we were hearing that a lot on the news as well. So then they don't want to reach out, they just stay put because they know what to expect with their abusers. Quarantine also exacerbates stress and other mental health issues for all partners, which may increase the risk of violence as well as impair one's ability to formulate or carry out their safety plans. Isolation can increase risk of neglect for women and children with physical disabilities who may be dependent upon others for mobility, groceries, and communications. And women who engage in sex work have experienced increased risks during the pandemic, with drop-in centers and other support services closed because of the coronavirus. Some sex workers have gone missing, while others are being intimidated by their clients. Many are experiencing extreme poverty, which leads to desperate situations where women and Two-spirited people put themselves at further risks. And then lastly, this is a high contact, high risk profession to practice during a pandemic. So experts say that most sex workers simply can't afford to stop doing their jobs because many can't show proof that they earned over $5,000 that year. People in that industry don't qualify for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit or EI. So it's like poverty. It's so many issues collected into one. And not all of the women that go missing are sex workers, but many of them are from the downtown east side area.
That is incredibly heartbreaking. And one thing, that I can just add is that it was really pretty remarkable how so many facilities, so many outreach facilities were able to pivot so quickly in the beginning because they knew ahead of time that gender-based violence was going to be on the rise because of the pandemic. But to hear about the intersectionality and the compounding challenges that people face, that is absolutely heartbreaking. So thank you for sharing that, Shelley. So can you tell me then what are some of the most common misconceptions about the issue of murdered and missing women and children? And again, I'll go to anyone, but by all means, Shelley, you already touched on this a little bit, so I'd be happy to hear more.
Yeah, I would invite Heather and Barb if you have any misconceptions that you know about just Indigenous women in general as well, I would say, because it just kind of goes with the territory in certain ways.
I'll comment. Thank you, Shelley. With the pandemic, I know a lot of Indigenous people, they gather, they love to gather, and they love to have the food, the ceremonies. The funerals are such a traditional thing amongst the Indigenous people. With the pandemic, the isolation that a lot of the members feel on reserves and is just overwhelming, and the violence that comes with the abusers that are the family members that are left at home with that. As for the question before, there are so many misconceptions about what the red dress represents. I know I've set up displays in our site, and people come over and ask, why do you have a red dress there? What is that about? And you have to sit down and have a conversation with those members who don't understand what it represents and how they need to get involved and pass the word along. Heather, do you have anything you need to say?
I would just say that people really have to challenge their racist assumptions about Indigenous peoples and really understand that somehow in society there's like a view that Indigenous people are inherently violent or uncivil, and people really need to challenge that. And it's a misconception that somehow Indigenous people are a part of this problem and are creating it, when that's just not the fact.
So I'll add in about 5 misconceptions that I thought of just off the top of my head for that answer. So that although missing and murdered Indigenous women and some of the girls that they're all sex workers in the downtown east side. And that they're disposable and they're not really all that important. They're just, like, not to be disrespectful, but to say like that they're just hookers and prostitutes that, came in, that got whatever they deserved because they were standing out there on the street. That is an attitude amongst people, that if you start talking about it, or if you don't start talking about it in something like this, but if you actually listen, you'll hear things like that being said. Or that it's Indigenous men killing the Indigenous women. So that does happen, but there's been misrepresented statistics that it's like 70% of the Indigenous women are being killed by Indigenous men. So that is an erroneous statistic. So they're thinking that that's what's happening in Indigenous communities and Indigenous relationships, and that Indigenous people are addicts, drunks, and they deserve what they get. And that Indigenous women are responsible for their situations. Why can't they just get a proper job and get off the street? It's so simple to do. I could do it. Why can't they? That type of idea. That they should just get over it. How often do we hear that as Indigenous people? Like I'm still hearing it in the staff room at the school. Do you know what I mean? Why aren't they getting over it? And this is people that just don't know. They just don't know the truth. They haven't learned it deeply enough, or that it's happened a long time ago, and that it's not something that's current. And that applies to kind of residential school and as well as what's happened and how residential school is part of why there's a missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic in our country. Like they go together, like, and it's colonial, racist systems that still are governing, you know, how we move about. And anything else anybody else wants to add?
Yeah, thanks for that, Shelley. You know, yeah, it's the deep biases that people are holding that, are holding us back from actually attaining justice for Indigenous women and girls and Indigenous people. Thank you so much for sharing about that. So that leads us into, another really great question about, what sort of actions then, if people are holding these deep biases and this is, a colonial system, what are some of the actions that people are taking to address these issues?
I always like coming up at the end and hearing other perspectives before mine. And so if Heather or Barb wants to say anything, actions that you know about to address violence against Indigenous women, because that's kind of that's what the Red Dress Project and campaign mean. It's violence against Indigenous women. I have a girlfriend and she's like, well, why do you have to use the word Indigenous? Why don't you just say it's our women are going missing, as in our Canadian women, right? Like maybe that would get more attention. And I was like, I don't know, maybe it would get more attention. I'm not sure, but it sort of takes away the truth of why it's happening, which is, again, the colonial systems, residential school. And I see Jody George wrote, it's everyone's problem, not just an Indigenous problem. Like we are citizens of Canada, which, colonial Canada, like it's frustrating when we're, 150 years later, we're still thought of as less than. Like when are we going to be viewed to be like equal in society? We're less than 5% of the population, for starters. So when you think about it, that Turtle Island and all of Canada, this big chunk of beautiful land, was like just roaming with all different types of Indigenous nations. There's 600 and I think 35, I'm going to say 34 different First Nations that we've been kind of coined across Canada, as Indian bands under the Indian Act. So there was like over 20 million on Turtle Island of Indigenous people, and now we're less than 5% of the population. Like we were just about annihilated, and that word genocide is appropriate to use. So what I see towards the positive happening, because I work in the school system, is I was driving by, I'm just going to say, I think it was the Como Lake, a busy street in front of a very kind of a large high school called Dr. Charles Best. And there's a park across the street that's like, it's just all trees. And there was like hundreds of dresses being hung, and that was in May, so on the May 5th day. And they not only hung the dresses, but they took sheets of paper and they put it in the sleeves because it's rainy, and they pinned them to the dresses. And I personally walked on both sides of the street, and I took pictures and I live streamed it on Facebook to show what was happening in a nearby community. In that was in Coquitlam. So So the schools are teaching about it. The high schools are teaching about it. And I wanted to phone that school and say, who's the teacher that led that? Because thank you so much. Because I've seen so many just people walking their dog, stopping and looking and being curious. So the Red Dress Project and campaigns are bringing higher awareness. Also, we're all wearing our pins, right? Here it is here, our red dress pins, which I believe you guys were the first ones to come out with this, and I love it and cherish it. And I know there's been some copycats by other unions, including my own CUPE and PSAC. I have one of theirs as well. So that's also something that's become known as well. I have, the moose hide campaign. The piece of moose hide, and that's actually a campaign as well, and it's more geared towards men. So it's men learning about violence against women and standing up for women. So that's a whole nother campaign, which I'm going to give you a link to at the end. And then when you see the men wearing this on their lapels, then you know that they know something about the campaign and their supporters. Unions are really good at making different things. We said T-shirts, like our union, have you seen our stolen sisters? This is our BBC lanyard. So it's things for people to talk about and get to know. This here is a card on how you will move reconciliation forward. And I believe that our women are considered our life givers. So if you're pinpointing life givers and eliminating them through getting missing or murdered, then you're going to have less of a population, right? Because the women are, I don't know if you've seen The Handmaid's Tale, but if the women are not able to produce children, and if the women aren't around, then you're going to have a lesser population, which was the colonial goal to begin with. And so it's still carried out, all these years later, 500 years later, our women are still targets. And before that, it was the children, right? And then the men, because they're reacting and trying to go into protection mode, let's put them all in the jails. So the jails are filled with our men, and our children are in the ground, and our women are going missing and we're just like trying to come out of genocide and be uplifted to where we should be on our own land. And then the last one I have here is this little booklet called Truth and Reconciliation. And so the 94 calls to action are in there, as well as the United Nations Declaration articles. So these two documents are the framework of reconciliation. You can order these little booklets. They're $7 from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And your union can order them, because I got mine from CUPE, and they can be given out to, we gave ours out to executive members, and then we have them to give out for certain events as well, Indigenous oriented events. So the unions are doing things to bring attention and awareness. But as I said at the beginning, I'm like, Indigenous people are getting to be past the idea, because we've known the truth all along. We know who didn't come home. We know whose sister, auntie, grandma, cousin didn't come home. We know whose children never made it home. It's not a secret. So when those children were being discovered, it wasn't a shock to the Indigenous nations at all. Like, we know, we totally know. So we need action. Like, we need action. And so and I know unions they write statements and we make things, but what can we do that's going to make a difference? So I know there's been a lot of donations to the Indian Residential School Society, and I know I'm missing an S, Survivors Society. There's 3 S's, ISSSS, Indian Resident, IRS at triple S, Indian Residential School Survivors Society. And I know a lot of donations went their way. And I want to draw attention to the First Nations Caring Society, which is started by Dr. Cindy Blackstock, who is an advocate for Indigenous children in poverty. And poverty is one of the greatest reasons why Indigenous people are still not thriving. So I would like to see money go towards that society. It's called First Nations Caring Society. And that they get some donations as well, because let's work towards, like, bettering the future generations, and also anything to do with suicide prevention in Indigenous communities, because that's the other thing. We lose a lot of people to that. Other things that are being done, Indigenous artists and designers are making jewelry, masks, t-shirts, apparel, the pins. There's concerts and gatherings and events to raise awareness or fundraise money. There's deeper education happening in schools, universities, and various training programs. There's the Be More Than a Bystander program that I love, that is a partnership between EVA BC, which is End Violence Against Women, and the BC Lions. And they don't have a strong component about Indigenous women. And I would like to push that so that they would have like a piece of that, or an Indigenous facilitator as part of that. But that's men teaching men how to intervene to decrease violence against women without getting violent as well. There's mural arts, there's walks, there's marches, there's rallies, there's protests and gatherings. And then the big one that happens more in the north is around these man camps. So these man camps, they get put up in order for resource extraction companies, corporations. And I know the Wet'suwet'en people have said, we don't want the pipeline through our territory. And then there's been all kinds of political, political conflict around it from the Indigenous nations against Indigenous nations, because some wanted it, but the hereditary chiefs from those nations didn't want it. And so it's so like, let's go down back to basics. Like, we just need women to be okay and protected and not in survival mode. As soon as a woman gets breasts when they're 11 or 12 years old, and they start to be looked at differently, and they start receiving, cat calls, and they're just not safe. And now we have to teach them how to defend themselves at 11 and 12 years old. And I do that in school. I'm like, you've already blossomed. Let's talk about how you're going to handle these people that are going to be giving you unwanted attention. And, I had the coolest girl. She's like, don't you worry, Shelley, I'm not going down without a fight. And I was like, oh my goodness, good on you for, already knowing. But I mean, imagine an 11-year-old having to say that, and us having to teach that. So we need to teach our boys and our men to respect women. And when did that change, that it's okay to violate our life givers that way? Okay, I'll stop.
That was a lot of actions, and certainly lots of different resources. And I want to thank each of you for putting in the chat, trying to keep up to you, Shelley. They put some links in the chat, so make sure that you check those out later. Great conversations in the chat, and absolutely, please, by all means, put your questions to Shelley and Barb and Heather in the chat as well. We'll take one more question, and then we'll go to you, the viewers, to see what you have to say as well. So I'm going to put this to Barb and Heather. Amidst so much grief and atrocity, and there's been a lot this year, what gives you hope through all of this?
Barb, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I think that what gives me hope is that there's more awareness now. There's people know what's going on. It's been in the news. We have known for a long time with the missing, murdered Indigenous women, and we've known about the children who gone missing in residential schools. What gives me hope is that things will change. People will be more aware. And with that awareness, there'll be more kindness in the world. Go ahead, Heather.
Well, I guess what gives me hope, or what inspires me, is just the strength of the Indigenous communities to continue to demand change. There's a lot of amazing emerging leaders. The youth really inspire me. And then there are some societal shifts that are happening as well, that people are becoming more aware of just the depth of the issues, and are having like a truer understanding and really getting educated. So I think it's good, and I think there's hope, and we always have to maintain some type of hope. So
Thank you, Heather. Shelley, what gives you hope?
Events like this, where we can reach wider audiences that will do some of these active changes that we're suggesting. When we do the red dress events and people are strolling along and they stop and they talk and they ask, so that awareness having people curious about it. And I think for me, it feels like right now that it's a time of truth for our nation. It's a time of truth. And I believe that those children, those initial 215 children and all the rest, which I saw a number which was 6,505 on somebody's. I don't know where to go to get the latest information, but we know it's just going to keep climbing daily as soon as some were searched. So I believe those children are the truth tellers that cannot be ignored. I've been speaking about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls for my 6 years that I've been in the labor movement, speeches upon speeches and lobbying the government with the same speeches and different events. And it's about honoring and awareness and us coming together and feeling like we're doing something. But the women and the girls did not garner the attention that these children are. So these children the women and the girls are subjects of a genocide as well. They are, right? And so, but these children have been the ultimate truth tellers. And so for that to happen in my lifetime, where I can actually work super hard to become a change maker so that it's better for my children and the children that I teach in school and future generations, that gives me hope. And there's more and more information. It just needs to be spread out, but it needs to be acted upon. And so right now they're creating the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Coalition is creating a national action plan, contributing to a national action plan. And so it sits though in the political trenches, it sits and it goes to back burners. And that bugs me because every time that happens and the motion is passed and they agree, and you know what I'm talking about, Barb Netterpaul, right? It bugs me because it's like another woman is going to die because of that motion. Like it's just more are dying, and we're just like let's do something, right? So So there's the 231 calls for justice with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report. The Red Women Rising Downtown East Side recommendation, there's 235 there. I found this amazing article called The Federal Pathway to Addressing Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and the Two-Spirit and the big long acronym. And that had like a tidy list. I really enjoyed that one that I found. Holding the red dress events, talk to people about it, support, attend marches and rallies. And the youth and the children and the future generations are learning more about the truth of Canada's colonial systems and its effects that it continues to have on Indigenous people. And allied groups and other social groups with common issues are also demanding changes. For example, Black Lives Matter, defund the police, change the justice systems, better mental health supports. And there's a report that just came out in November 2020 called In Plain Sight that I think you guys are aware of, being healthcare workers, right? And so things like that hard truth needs to come out, and then we need to make action we need so much change. All the systems just need a huge overhaul for our people to be safer.
Absolutely. And Shelley, just because you brought it up, the In Plain Sight report by Dr. Mary-Ellen Turpel-Lafon was a report done in healthcare, identifying and talking to healthcare workers and to patients and residents and others around the anti-Indigenous racism that they either experience or they've witnessed. It's a tremendous report. There's several calls to action in that report as well. And, the HEU is committed to, doing our part to making sure that our members are educated and taking the right steps forward. I'm watching in the chat and I see that there's some really great comments too. There is, lots of thanks to you, Shelley, for sure. But I just want to, also point out, Jody George had mentioned as well, voting for a federal New Democratic Party, having that government is one way to advance, these issues. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Sister Jody on that. And of course, Sister Rhonda saying, you are all change makers, and we certainly can see that in you. But it is, like you said earlier, Shelley, this is all of our responsibility. We all need to be taking action where we can. You have given us some incredible resources to look into. So thanks to HEU for also posting the In Plain Sight report. So we do have a question for folks. So the question is, how do fellow union members respond to organizing red dress events in your locals? What are your tips for other HEU members who want to take action on these important issues? I'm going to put that to Heather and Barb.
So our committee, the Indigenous People Standing Committee, we worked on a red dress event toolkit for HEU locals. And this basically goes through all of the steps to kind of guide you through. So there's like a multitude of things. You can have a red dress event at an area in your community. You can have something at your local, maybe inviting a guest speaker. So it really highlights specific dates like May 5th to the Day to Raise Awareness, and October 4th, Day of Action. So hopefully eventually we're going to be having that out to locals. And it's very extensive and a great guide. Barb, do you have anything to add that you can think of?
Barb Clark, anything you want to add?
Mm-hmm. No, Heather pretty much said it all. As an Indigenous committee, we actually have been working on that, and that should be coming forward next. It'll be available to all the locals as well, as you request it. Thank you.
Yeah, and just one other thing to add, just to highlight that there is the pin, and there's also the No More Stolen Sisters T-shirt that we worked on as well. That's new just this year. So if people can take the time and look at that.
That's available on the HEU boutique. I'll get HEU to put that into the chat as well. And the only thing I can add is that there is funds for locals to organize red dress events. So you just simply have to apply and we'll help out with those. And again, I know that there's some folks that are watching. We know that there's an event coming up shortly, and if you or anybody else that you know of has a red dress event that wants to amplify that here today, make sure you put that in the chat. All right, I'm just looking at 6:23, and it sounds like that we can go to one of the videos, Shelley, if you'd like. Which one would you like? The dance video?
I think that's a great way to end, because it's kind of it's an honoring video from the Canadian Labour Congress that was put on at a human rights event. I also wanted to just mention, depending if you're in the north or the south in different, I'm not sure about smaller communities, but there's always on February 14th as well, there's rallies and marches, and it went on during the pandemic last year. I didn't attend it because I wasn't vaccinated yet, but I think this year I'll for sure attend it in February, and I've gone for 3-4 years in a row. So it's called the, what did we call it? It's not called the Missing Murder, it's
Women's Memorial March.
Thank you. The Women's Memorial March, yes. And they have something similar up in the north as well on that Day of Love, February 14th. So this is a great video from the Canadian Labour Congress.
That is such an impactful video. Thanks for that. Thanks for putting that up, and I'm really glad that we had an opportunity to actually close with that. It sends us all off with the right intention that Shelley said around, it's time that we take action. This has been so incredible, such an engaging conversation. And I have to say, I learned so much from all of you. And I really, really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us this afternoon. And, I just want to say thanks to each of you for all you do, not just, thank you for being on the panel, but thank you for all you do within the community to advance the issues around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and around Indigenous people. You are all incredible change makers, and we really, really appreciate all that you do. Looking in the chat, you can see there's lots of appreciation being sent your way. And of course, there is a link to feedback on the webinar. Click the link and provide us some feedback so that we can get even better as we go through this webinar series. I thought it was great for our first one, and I'm really happy that our first peoples were the first ones to launch us in such a great way. And you all did amazing work. And I want to thank you yet again for all that you do. You're amazing people. Thanks, everybody, and have a great evening. Thanks for participating.
I think there was something to highlight that Luella wrote.
Oh, okay, good. Oh,
Yes.
I missed that. Okay, October 3rd. Luella has put in the chat, October 3rd from 12 o'clock to 4 o'clock in Bear Creek Park. That's in Surrey. There is going to be a red dress gathering. The address is there, 13750 88th Avenue. Again, that's in Surrey. Anybody else that is organizing red dress events, put it in the chat before we leave, and do please make it out to those events and participate and bring your red dresses to show as well. Okay, thanks for shouting out that, Shelley. Really appreciate that. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.